For too long, global conversations about Africa have been shaped by outdated assumptions that fail to reflect the reality on the ground. Here to challenge the clichés and discuss Africa from a more accurate, opportunity-driven lens, we have a stacked-up line and a very fabulous first panel of this morning. Please welcome to the stage Tariq Mughani, Bibi Bakaru Yusuf, Ronak Gopaldas, Comfort Arrow, moderated by Hosh Ibrahim.
Great pronunciation, by the way.
Hello, South by Southwest. You all good? All right, good morning. Thank you all for being here so early. I'm Hosh Ibrahim, and for the past 20 years, we at the Movim Foundation have been focused on the importance of good governance as the key to deliver development on the continent of Africa. Now, people say a lot about the continent of Africa, but in my experience, the gap between myth and reality is that it's most amplified when people have a little bit of information and a large amount of general bias. So, in this session, I have four very informed people, well, there's three actually right now, but one's coming, who work in and on the African continent, who are going to set us straight on the reality of Africa today in politics, and for that we have Comfort Arrow, President and CEO of International Crisis Group. I'm going to clap for everyone, thank you. And then for business, we have Ronak Gopaldas, who's the political economist and director of Signal Risk. And then for finance, we have Tariq Mughani, who is the founder and group CEO of Affinity Africa Bank. Whoa. And the third empty seat at the end is for my good friend Bibi Bakaru Yusuf, who is the co-founder of Cassava Republic, who is going to talk about culture, but she's fighting through the culture of London traffic at the moment. So she'll be back there at the end. So please, let's get started. So Comfort. My first question of myth and bias. Most people in this audience will say that they hear so much about war and conflict in Africa. And you can't deny that too many countries are fighting internally and regionally over land, resources, and power. Yet, the IMF says that 14 out of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world right now are in Africa. So, who is telling the truth and what is a myth?
Right, thank you. And Bibi's just walked in, which is
okay, great.
So we can really get rolling.
Give her a round of applause
as well. Yeah.
So yeah, and that's Bibi in the back there.
Thank you. Good question on the panel. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think with every region, every continent, there are multiple narratives as well. And a continent of 54 naturally has multiple narratives as well. And there's a tendency to conflate and have one picture of the continent. And you'll all remember, well, I'm looking at the generation in front of you, maybe you may not remember, but there was a picture on the Economist of a hopeless continent. And this was at the height of the civil war in Sierra Leone and Liberia in West Africa. And fast forward, the Economist, I think it was about 2015, put out another front cover called Africa Rising as well. And it struck me because it assumed that there's only one narrative that you could tell. And it's like, well, in a continent that's so diverse and geographically by 2050, it will be the leading continent. How can you have one single narrative? So 2025, or this year's report by the IMF, talked about hard-won gains under pressure. And it projected that Africa growth would be around about 4.5 for 25, and the projection that it offered for 26 was optimistic. However, when its report came out just 2 months ago, it then started to show a reversal to say that those gains of 4.5 will end up being about 4.3%. And that was largely because of external shocks coming from the Middle East war and Iran, the fertilizers, oil, energy. And when you think about it, for your country, for example, Hosh, where you come from, 54% relies on seaborne fertilizers as well. The east of Africa, Horn of Africa, is the one that is feeling the immediate impact of the shocks as well. And these are countries already that are affected vulnerable, fragile countries and conflict as well. So there is a story, there is a good story out there of growth projections. There is a good story out there of infrastructure, of everybody wanting to come on the continent, of the commercial activities, of infrastructure investment. But one cannot get away from the other hard truths, which is that the most important pieces of Africa themselves, the ones that you see that ought to be reliable at the front end of things themselves, are facing various kind of domestic crises that often end up also escalating to violence as well. So let me stick with West Africa, for example. It was for a long time the poster child of democratization, where you've got a Sahel that is facing turbulence. And then you've got Nigeria, for example, where, home for me, 36 states are now also under the purview of sort of the military having to play the role of the police as well. And then you've got in the center, the DRC, there's been in perennial crisis for the last 3 decades. And then we've got the Horn of Africa, a pivotal region that should be the heartbeat of Africa, that it's also going through a crisis. We thought we saw a vibrant, youthful-led revolution in Sudan that has now been stolen by the security forces as well. So there is a narrative. Unfortunately, it's also a story of civil wars, internationalized civil wars of violence, of kidnapping, of human rights violations. But this sits alongside progress, of opportunities, and also of growth as well.
So it's really like a 50-50. There's positive,
yeah.
and there is negative.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say 50-50. I mean, if you break it down by region, the one that I think is worrying for me is the Horn of Africa, because we're watching a classic situation where you have proxy wars or where you see conflicts bleeding into one another. And all the countries that you'd want to rely on to be the engine room, to be regions that are both vibrant culturally, infrastructure, investment, they're all in some kind of dire straits. But you know what? The continent also reflects a bigger picture. I mean, in Europe, we've seen a crisis of democracy. Yeah. In the Americas, we've also seen a lot of turbulence as well, and in Asia. So in a sense, Africa is a microcosm of a wider problem that each country is facing. It takes on a different meaning in the continent because it doesn't necessarily have all the necessary infrastructure and institutions to absorb all those tensions as well.
Yeah, and so other regions have, they also are facing, problems because of the Gulf War and climate change and everything, but they're much more vulnerable.
You're much more vulnerable because some of those problems that you've just highlighted are not owned by the continent. It's a recipient of some of these issues. The climate story is not one that was caused by the continent as well. When you start thinking through it, when you look at what's happening in the Middle East, even before that, you had COVID. Before that, you had the climate stresses as well. So that there are internal things that the continent has to own. About democratization, about governance, about economic governance as well. But there are also external shocks that the continent itself cannot necessarily shield itself from. Some of them weather the storms pretty well, and some don't necessarily have the shock absorbers to contain them as well. But I would say that the countries that you would hope to weather the storm, that you'd hope to be the engine room, both of change, of progress, setting the standards for multilateralism themselves, are going through those crises. We can name them: Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya, for example, are the ones that I would look at as well. And then you've got others on the outliers: Algeria, Egypt. They're going through their own sort of crises as well.
Thank you, Ronak. All business investment requires some speculation on risk. Different sectors are naturally going to have different risk premiums, from agriculture and oil production to AI to space exploration. The geography and the dangers matter. So, is there really a risk premium being levied on the African investments, or are you just asking for preferential treatment?
Controversial question. Okay, I'm going to answer your question using 3 examples. So
yes.
In my work, I travel a lot to various countries, in my work looking at risk in Africa, and just to get a sense of the lay of the land and what's happening on the ground. So I did 3 trips recently. First trip, landed at the airport. There was a 2-hour line. The systems were offline, that famous South African proverb, complete shambles. And the next day, tried to pay for something. The credit card systems weren't working across the whole city. Okay. Second example, went to a country, the government is routinely on the edge of shutting down based on debt standoffs. There's political violence. The head of the Central Statistics Agency was fired. The central bank governor is under pressure to cut interest rates, and the president's family is getting immunity for their tax affairs. Third country is about to have its 7th prime minister in 10 years, and the policy is all over the place.
Sounds familiar.
Are you shouting in America and Britain, or where are you going?
So yeah, people immediately think Africa, but I'm talking about Norway, I'm talking about the US, and I'm talking about the UK.
Yeah.
And what would the narratives be in that context? In the first instance, system failure and dysfunction.
Yeah.
Second instance, it would be state capture, which is what we had in the Zuma era in South Africa. And in the third instance, we'd call it a dysfunctional banana republic. Okay, so my point here is around the language and the vocabulary that we use when we're discussing risk in Africa. It's crisis and corruption and conflict. It's debt, disease, and dysfunction. And that's the lens that we tend to paint, right? And then we make sweeping generalizations. There are 3 coups in West Africa. The whole continent is unsecure and politically unstable. 3 countries default because of COVID. And what happens? Africa's got a debt problem. But we don't look at the response to COVID and how effective that was. We don't look at the fact that South Africa put together a coalition government in 2 weeks after a historic election. Botswana had its first change of power. Namibia's got its first female president. So all of these things get discounted because we sweep Africa into this one narrative. Africa's a country. Right, to Comfort's point around the hopeless continent. So what are the reasons for that? I think number one is information asymmetry, right? So we've got this situation where, and this is why I have a business, right? There's so much generalization and so much simplistic narrative construction around the continent that we misprice the risk. And the data supports this. The IMF, the UNDP have come out with various reports saying that Africa pays in excess of what its fundamentals justify for its debt in interest costs. And so what I'm saying here is not that Africa is low risk. We know that it's tricky to do business in many of these instances. What I'm saying is that the risk is mispriced and it's misunderstood. It's over-penalized, over-generalized, and that's the fundamental issue. Because in the same way in Europe we differentiate between Hungary and Germany, we should be able to differentiate between Mali and Morocco.
Brilliant. And
Good point.
you have many fans here, I can see. You just a small side thing, actually, before I move on to Tarek. You're talking about the mispricing there. How do we? What would you, in your analysis, would be the best way that we can to change that mispricing?
Speak to signal risk.
Okay, apart from a plug to yourself.
Yeah, I think nuance is important, right? So basically, the way we tend to operate is that you've got your primary sources, your news agencies, your CNNs, your Skies, your IMFs, etc. But you've got to supplement that with your own research, with your own networks, with just understanding, to Comfort's point, that these are kind of universal problems. They're not unique to Africa. I always say there are 2 types of markets these days. There's emerging markets and submerging markets, and they're starting to converge.
Interesting. Great. Speaking of finance, Tarek, banks are for people with money. Yes, Africa has the lowest rate of people in the world who use banks, but that's because it has the highest poverty rates in the world. When Africans get money, isn't that when they will start using banks and not before?
Wow, another controversial statement there. So I think the problem arises from the fact that Africans in general have been designed out of formal banking systems. And I think everything that we're probably going to discuss on this panel today is around where does that view, that perception come from, and from which lens as well too. Somebody made the argument the other day that I'm Ghanaian, but I'm ethnically Middle Eastern. My response to them is east of what? Where is that comment coming from, right? And the myth around banking in particular within the African context, and I don't know if any of you kind of migrated here or expatriated here and opened a bank account, but I moved here in the 90s when I went to university. it was actually really hard for me to get a bank account because A, I had to have an address, but to get an address and rent a place, I needed a bank account. On top of that, I had to have 3 years of history as well too. Because that's how banking was invented. It was invented in the global north under the perception, basically, that you are an individual, you're salaried, you have a history, and you are, as a result, you are de-risked. And with that information, you're able to walk into a NatWest and open a bank account. So with that framework in mind, because that's how banks work, when they're replicated in our part of the world, by design and by intention, you basically neglect over 60% of the population. And I'll give an example in terms of some of the work that we do. This is not going to be a plug like Signal Risk. But it's really interesting because 78% of the population in Africa are informally employed, right? We have customers that bank with us who work out of shipping containers. There are women that work from 6 a.m. as sole proprietors till 11 p.m. 6 days a week, right? There's an opportunity cost for them to go to a bank branch. They have to leave their place of work. When that happens, revenue goes to zero, right? So why should they even bother banking with an institution? On top of that as well too, they are informally employed, right? They're not registered businesses. There's nothing to say that that's a bad thing. It's a great part of our culture. But the problem with that individual is that they don't have the right documentation to be able to open a bank account. And as a result, they've been designed out of systems simply for who they are because they don't have a paycheck. They don't have a way of proving their ID as well too. And by the design of banking, they've been ignored from formal financial services. And that applies to 60% of adults in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a whopping, whopping number. That woman in particular that I talk about, if you look at the average customer that we have in the organization, she earns north of $5,000 a month. It has nothing to do with how much she affords. Wow. It's to do with the fact that design of banking have neglected her. I'll give you a couple more stats. So us at Affinity, about a quarter of our customers deposit with us each day. Now think about that, right? For you guys in this room that are formally employed, you get a paycheck once a month, right? So once a month, you get money that hits your account. Our customers get money into their account every 3 days. Now, banking systems here, if any of you guys have traveled and tried to use your card in a high-risk country, like whenever I go to Ghana, Lloyd's Bank calls me up and freaks out and tells me that my bank card has been stolen. I keep telling them, and it's been 20 years, that no, I'm in Ghana. We're like, well, no, somebody stole your card. I'm like, no, I'm in Ghana. It's a bit of, it's very annoying, as I'm sure you guys all know. So if you take a look at our customer type, every time there's something that's untoward that happens, like you're getting a lot of inflows, financial systems, it flags that money laundering is happening. That's what's basically happening in your account. But that's not what's happened to our customer. Our customer behavior is very different to the customer that exists in the global north. So by design, they've been neglected out of formal financial services, which is why, and I have a couple of my team members in the audience as well too, we created a bank that basically focused on the majority of Africans. We had to reinvent banking and use technology as a way of giving access to the average African a bank account that is affordable, that's easy to open up. It takes 30 seconds, and of course, we use tech to do all this. And over the last 18 months, we've gone from about 10,000 customers when we're kind of prototyping and launching, where we just hit 150,000 customers with no marketing spend through word of mouth in 18 months. And it has nothing to do with the fact that Africans cannot be banked or don't have enough money. It's to do with the fact, like with most of the things in our part of the world, they've been designed out of formal systems simply because that's how those systems were designed in the global north.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry. So, Bibi, thank you for being here. Here's my question to you. To be fair, Bibi, what Africa needs most, as these have just said, to develop is an economics transformation. Culture, though fun and sexy in comparison, is really a soft power add-on for entertainment and tourism. It's important for us all to celebrate our culture, joy, and energy, of course. But after we've achieved the real valuable growth, which is economic.
I think it's an interesting question to frame culture and economics as two opposing forces. And I think that you can think of culture as the bedrock of economics. Often we think economics is hard and culture is soft.
Yeah.
But when you think about the superpowers or the economic powers of the world, what do we know about them? We know about them through BBC, the Goethe Institute, the Alliance Française, Hollywood, and all of those so-called soft powers, right? It is the very soft power that you're talking about that enables us to have confidence in the economic power. It is what the economic infrastructure is built on. If you think about a country like Nigeria, where I think I have my numbers here, Nollywood is the second largest film industry in the world, and the creative economy contributes about $7 billion in GDP for Nigeria. It probably employs more people than the oil sector, okay? So culture is not just mere entertainment. It is what allows for us to have confidence in an economic superstructure. It is what allows us for people to think about who they are and the narrative that circulates in the world. What Ronak just told us about the 3 examples he gave, we would, in our heads, we will assume that these stories belong to Africa. These examples were Africans, but yet they were in European systems, right? European cultures.
Yep.
So I want us to always think, when we think about culture, not to just think of culture as entertainment. It is culture that enables us to be who we are. It is what enables us to move around with confidence. When America decides to invade another country, it is the cultural export that gives them that power. It is what made us to think that when Hurricane Katrina happened and Nigerians were having fundraising gala for America because they had never imagined America to be so poor, right? Because what America exports to the world is their culture, is Hollywood, is the music industry.
Confidence.
Is the confidence, right? Yeah. And what we're seeing today is African cultural export, whether it's in Afrobeats, it's in fashion, in music, in literature, right? So culture is not something that is just soft. We think of the Medici. Who think about the Medici? We don't, right? But we remember the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. We remember the Rockefeller, the libraries they built. We don't remember the oil companies or how they made their money, but we do remember the cultures that's been left behind. So I don't want us to think about culture as just simply soft. It is not soft, it's real economy, right? This is why we talk about the cultural industry. They're not just feel good or, like you just said, joyous, right? They're not just joyous, they are the ways in which we represent ourselves to ourselves. Yeah. And they give us opportunity to imagine ourselves. And what we're seeing more and more in Africa, as the cultural confidence rises and is projected throughout the world, you're also seeing the beginning of a different narrative. So I just want to stop there and just saying the map we have of culture, economics, was mapped out in the 1960s or maybe 1950s, and it needs to be redrawn. We need a new map. We need a new ways of talking about Africa. We need a new way of talking about not just Africa, but also blackness. And I want to talk about that just very briefly, because when we're able to think about Africa differently, we would have to think about black people wherever they are in the world, whether they're in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in the UK. If Africa is liberated, the entire black world will be liberated. And I think it starts from culture and the cultural confidence that we project onto the world.
Brilliant. A sort of a follow-up question to that, if you don't mind, Bibi, and we're talking about before, when people talk about, import and export, many people see that, as Africa is more of an overall importer of culture or exporter of culture. How do you feel about that?
So, to kind of reframe what you're saying, it's in simplistic terms. Africa is a consumer of culture rather than a producer of culture. And I think that's just another myth of what who Africans are and what they do. And Africa has been the source for most cultural output in the world. If we think of our many Western popular culture, pop culture, especially in music, whether we're thinking about jazz, we're thinking about blues, we're thinking about hip-hop, soul music, funk. Think about it. Their base culture is African rhythmic pattern, African tonal world, right? And the African musical complexity. These are the baseline for many of the musical cultures that we think about in the world. So I don't think Africa is just mere consumption. It is the net producer of many of the world's popular infrastructure that we think about. And so when you think of consumption, I don't think there's any consumption without production. They are feeding each other. As Africa is producing to the world, it's also receiving back. But the difference is that many people have been raiding African cultural heritage, right? The only thing that has not been happening is crediting it. And what we need is, think about our IP take our IP more seriously, think about distribution and ownership, so that when the cultures are coming in or when they're traveling out, we have ownership of them. You think about Burna Boy winning the Grammy, for example. He didn't just win the Grammy. It wasn't just well known in Europe. It was because there was a recognition on the continent already. Davido, Wizkid, you name any of our musical exports across Africa, they were already producing on the continent. And it was after the fact. And let's think about it. Europe is parasitic, right? It's a parasitic culture on Africanness, on blackness, on the other. And therefore, because it's parasitic, like any good parasite, it wants to reproduce itself and be the queen or the champion of that, and then it changes our mind of not thinking of ourselves as the producers. And this is why you can ask the question you've just asked, right? That Africans just import. And something Tariq said about design, it is not accidental that Africa is framed as an importer of culture, when in fact it's always exporting culture, but in a very surreptitious way that people don't want to pay back that debt that Africans are producing. So I just want us to always think about consumption and production go hand in hand, but at the same time, Africa is continuously reproducing and giving out to the world. I just came back from Lagos yesterday, and I'm always, every time I'm in Lagos or anywhere in Africa, I'm like, the energy, the production that's going on here, whether it's in clothing, in people writing stories and thinking about how they're going to publish. And so I'm a publisher, right? I'm not a music person. And it's just always mind-blowing that I cannot just simply think about Africa as a net consumer without thinking about the huge production. What is needed is more investment to make that out into the world.
Great, thank you. Please, yes. So, back to comfort here. So, back to politics. Given exactly, we're rolling that way. You can see it. Okay, this is another of my myth-telling questions. Given the spate of recent coups across the continent, on the back of literally hundreds of coups across Africa since independence, I think there's actually been 220 attempted coups, of which 109 were successful. Do you think Africa is just allergic to democracy? Aren't most Africans just happier with strong military generals in charge? Take it away.
Why are you giving me these questions?
Because there are myths out there, and I think it's really important that we sort of give you the opportunity to tell the truth.
All right, let's do a quick math. So that's 1.5 since 1957. Every year. Look, the last one coup, if that's how we want to label it, was in the Sahel, and there were specific to the Sahel. You had Guinea and Gabon, and then we had the stolen transition, I would say, in Sudan. So one, the continent is not allergic to democracy. Number two, I think you have to unpack why these coups happened, and particularly why they happened in the Sahel at the time that it happened, because it was in that particular region, so it wasn't across the continent. But what was striking about the Sahel was where you had seen since 2011 or 2012, you had seen a build-up of external military forces, whether it was the UN or the French intervention, and some of them coming from the region, to stabilize Mali. And in effect, if you ask Malians categorically, why those coups took place, number one, it's hard to tell the story of what happened in Mali and Burkina and Niger without looking at what those intervention forces did or did not do. Fact number one, the security dynamics on the ground hadn't changed. Fact number two, there hadn't been any substantive changes in the governance architecture in these countries. Fact number three, when democracy was performed, it was performative, because the security veto, i.e. what the West wanted for the Sahel, did not conform with what those societies wanted as well. And when there was, and I really want to underline this in Mali, when there was a reversal of a democratic effort in Mali, for example, through the National Assembly, through the Legislative Assembly, when the government of the day tried to undermine what happened in the National Assembly, where were you, the West, in terms of calling that out as undemocratic? Where were you, ECOWAS, who has a clause within its own governance charter about undemocratic overtake of government? The National Assembly is a form of government. So where were you when that happened? And then when there was the usurping of the president at the time, you called that a coup. So a number of people were asking, when is a coup not a coup? We thought there was a coup when you interfered with the outcome of the legislative election in Mali. So that's number one. Number two, the reasons why you saw a youthful population, both in Mali and Niger and in Burkina Faso, get onto the street to support, yes, men in uniform, was not because they were anti-democracy. They were unhappy with the governments of the day, which hadn't changed their lives, which hadn't changed their bread and butter situation, which had sold them a lie about what democracy was about. And for a number of these kids, break down what democracy means. It's not about, I get to vote every 4 years. It's about, what are you changing about my life? You told me a story that if I go to school, if I get my degree, if I do X, Y, and Z, I was going to get a job at the end. All these things never happened as well. So I think we should be careful about assuming that what happened in these three countries, and Guinea and Gabon, meant that these were societies that were anti-democracy. When you look closely at these societies, there was dissatisfaction. And a number of these leaders were there, or there was a sense that they were there to service the other, and the other wasn't them. The other was what the West wanted, the other was what an elite wanted, the other was what other forces wanted, but it did not change their day-to-day livelihood. And I come back for a deliberate reason, Hosh, to what happened in the Horn of Africa. We had two important transitions that were taking place. Everybody saw the most youthful, the most dynamic, the most kaleidoscopic transition attempt taking place in Sudan. That was stolen in broad daylight as well. Now we're paying the price also of not helping that transition take hold as well. And we have to ask ourselves, what did we do wrong to enable that process in Sudan as well? So it's not that there's an undemocratic impulse on the continent, but people want certain things. There's a standard that people want, and it's about, why can't I have those job opportunities? Why can't the system work in a way that makes sense to me? And you have told me that if I do X, Y, and Z, that I would get access to industry, that I would get access to jobs, that I would get access to civil rights and things like that. But you've also told me a myth as well, my society as well. So.
Yeah. And I think actually what you're saying about the delivery of democracy,
Yeah.
I think we can see it all over the world, right? Everyone is kind of feeling that same pushback. So, Ronak, having access to, the most valuable stocks in the world right now are the US tech sector, right? We can see NVIDIA, Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, etc. Shareholders making huge profits that we can all see. So why are you saying betting on Africa is the most compelling opportunity in the world right now?
Yeah, AI mania is very real.
Yes.
You can see it. But if you look at what's behind this and everything required to drive the so-called fifth industrial revolution, which is decarbonized, data-driven, and digital, all of the inputs required for that are primarily found in Africa. Cobalt, nickel, copper, all of these kind of raw materials and critical minerals, so to speak, are found in Africa. And they're valuable and they're critical because they're scarce, they're important for security, and they're important for sustainability.
Yeah.
So Africa is central to this equation. Now, there's 3 reasons why fundamentally I'm an optimist about the continent. So number 1 is just the numbers, right? Africa is too big to ignore. By 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be from Africa.
Yeah.
By the end of the century, it's going to be 1 in 3. Now, I'll give you these statistics. More people were born in Nigeria in 2024 than in the whole of Europe. 7.5 million compared to 7.2. Might have something to do with Afrobeats, I don't know. But the point is that those numbers are compelling, right? And then when you overlay that with the fact that global trade is changing, the geometry of international trade is changing away from China, the US, African connectivity, land, rail, and digital is going to be central. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement will be the largest free trade agreement in the world, a free trade area in the world. If it materializes, that will be bigger than India. So you can't ignore that. So that's the first reason. The second reason I would argue is that creativity is our superpower in Africa. We innovate out of necessity. The other day I went to watch the play The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind about a story about a young man in Malawi whose village was facing famine because of drought, and he repurposed a bicycle and created a windmill, which powered the entire village and saved his family and the whole village, right? And there are millions of stories like that every day in Africa because people have to innovate because there is no support system or safety net, right? And I think that's our superpower. We've seen it with M-Pesa, we've seen it with how we can leapfrog and hack the ladder around innovation. And when you combine young people with innovation, I think that's super compelling. And the third reason, it probably doesn't make sense, but it's irrational optimism, right? I think the kids say Delulu is the Sululu. But basically, Africa is being asked to do what no continent in the world has ever done before. Democratize and industrialize simultaneously in the context of going green when the robots are coming, right? So we've got to come up with a creative playbook over here. And what I think is exciting, look, some people will frame it as risk, but our risks are our rewards and our challenges are our opportunities in Africa. So it's the one continent in the world where I feel like you can do well and you can do good simultaneously. You solve a big societal issue, you'll make a lot of money. And that intersection of kind of purpose, impact, money is where you can achieve not only success, but also significance.
Okay. Tariq, so you need to have assets to hold against credit. That's why developed countries like the USA and Europe have over 100% rate of credit to GDP. Africa has a 27% credit to GDP rate. Isn't that because business in Africa are high risk and too poorly governed to be able to borrow money?
So there's a huge injustice, as we discussed, that 60% of adults in Africa don't have access to bank accounts. It's even worse when it comes to access to credit. Like only less than 10% have access to credit. And without borrowing and financial inclusion, you don't have access to healthcare, you don't have access to education, you don't have access to clean energy. I think there are 2 reasons why that exists. Firstly, banking regulation was developed in Basel, Switzerland. It was put together by the G20 and 7 other countries, none of whom were African, by the way. And the way in which risk is defined is you have data on a customer, so if you borrow, let's say it's a mortgage, it's collateralized. As a result, the risk of a mortgage defaulting is about 4%. If it's a credit card, it's about 20%, right? And banks follow that framework and lend on behalf of that. I will tell you that in Ghana in particular and other countries in Africa, the risk weighting of every single loan that gets given out by the regulator is at 100%, which means by default, banks don't lend because that's the perception of risk. First reason, there's not enough data, and it's a cycle of you don't collect, you don't give loans, you don't collect data, you can't reframe the models, right? Because we were designed out of them. The second reason is actually our interest rate as well too. We are borrowing in multiples of 8 times what US and European countries are borrowing at, because that is the perception of risk. So if I'm lending to you and an interest rate on a loan is 100%, how on earth can you grow as an individual? Because that's what we're told the cost of risk is in our country. And to give you a couple of stats, not only does Africa pay like 8 times more than US European countries, our revenue to debt is 48% in our part of the world versus 3.2% in OECD countries. And that is huge. I'll end what I'm saying by just telling you a story that we've raised money at Affinity. It's close to $15 million now, mostly from VCs. Thank you. Not an achievement, by the way. Hopefully the results will tell. But I remember getting on a call with a large European investor. They brought on board 40 of their LPs. I thought I did a great job with this pitch. It was sexy, it was cool, there was a demo. I was like, I got it, I'm gonna raise 100 million at the end of this. On this Zoom, video on, no one had their video on from like big VCs in the US, elsewhere. I only got one question, and it was typed out. The only question that person asked is, what about corruption? Because that's how they view us.
Yeah.
So I will end basically with one of my favorite sayings, which we talk about all the time. Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.
Fantastic. So I think we're almost at time, but I just want to throw Bibi one last quick question, a really simple one. What truth should people know about culture in Africa today that you think? One thing.
What truth?
Bala beans.
Eh?
Bala still beans.
What truth is Africa is always adaptive and always reimagining itself at core. This is a continent that really thrives on adaptiveness and what Ronick will call innovation. It is always already innovating. The very nature of people across the continent, it is about innovating, it is about restructuring itself, and is encoded in the DNA of many African societies. It is not something that was imported. It is part and parcel of the cultural DNA, and it is what got transmitted across the Middle Passage.
Thank you very much. Please thank my panel. Thank you so much for being here today.